And now we'll turn to our second panel, which is the implications of the Palestinian Authority's diplomatic initiative for both the United States and Israel. And here again we have an absolutely extraordinary panel to analyze the question. We're first going to hear from Elliot Abrams, who served as Deputy National Security Advisor for Global Democracy Strategy from 2005 to 2009, handling Middle East affairs in the George W. Bush administration. Elliot, of course, has broad experience in Latin America as well, having served as Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs in the Reagan administration. He's currently Senior Fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations here in Washington, and writes with deep insight for his own blog as well as for numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal and the Weekly Standard, among others. We at Hudson are proud to have counted him here as a Senior Fellow in the 1990s, where he served before going on to being President of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Elliot.
Thank you very much. It's always nice to be back at Hudson. The background to these recognitions of Palestine that we're discussing today is the Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations. And they have been negotiating for decades. But those negotiations foundered after January 2009. On President Obama's second day in office, he appointed Senator George Mitchell as his Middle East envoy, and he adopted what I would call the George Mitchell-Rahm Emanuel view, which is the way to get the negotiations moving forward was to ram a construction freeze down Israel's throat. Once the United States adopted the view that an absolute construction freeze in the settlements and in Jerusalem was a prerequisite to negotiations, so, of course, did President Abbas. In a really quite candid interview with Newsweek about a month ago, he expressed his unhappiness, you might even say his bitterness, about this. Here's what he said, quote, when the United States proposed this construction freeze as a prerequisite, he said, quote, "I said, okay, I accept. We both went up the tree. After that, he," that's President Obama, "he came down with a ladder, and he removed the ladder, and he said to me, jump. 3 times he did it." So there was by the end now, no trust between the Israelis and Palestinians, no trust between the Israelis or Palestinians and the United States. The result has been there have been no negotiations for more than 2 years now. And the Palestinians, seeing no negotiations and not wishing to jump over this hurdle of negotiating despite there being no construction freeze, Palestinians began to look elsewhere. They're unable to get back to the table, so they began to think, what shall we do? Another part of this context is that the Palestinian leader, President Abbas, who is the head of the Fatah party, of the PLO, and of the Palestinian Authority, is retiring. He's, I think, 76 years old, and will be leaving the scene voluntarily. He does not want, at this juncture in his life and his career, to take on the challenge of a negotiation where he will have to make difficult compromises that will end with him being called a traitor to the Palestinian cause. He knows he's an interim leader between Yasser Arafat and whatever is coming next. Having lost Gaza and an election to Hamas, he wants to leave now with at least the appearance of national unity. So one of the things he has done is this agreement with Hamas on a unity government, without Hamas having made any compromises at all with respect to the 3 quartet conditions. The U.S. would not or could not, as he had hoped, force Israel into compromises, so no negotiating track. Instead, that path, unity with Hamas, and one other path, to turn to the UN and the international community for these endorsements, you might say, for this recognition. Of course, the PLO already had the Islamic countries where it wanted them, that is, supportive. They turned to Latin America to pick up another series of endorsements over the last year. And they got recognition of a sort from Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Ecuador, Bolivia, Uruguay. And in all of those cases, there was a mention of the so-called 67 borders. Chile, Peru, as we just heard, Costa Rica, recognized a Palestinian state without specifying the borders. The decision was, in most cases, I would say, pretty easy for the states in question. There was pressure from local Muslim communities. There was pressure from Arab governments, Arab embassies. The countervailing pressure from Israel or from local Jewish communities was not enough. I mean, one way of saying it is every single Muslim state said do it, and every single Jewish state said don't do it, and that's how they came out. In many cases, they viewed it as essentially cost-free, while saying no could have been costly. It could have been costly in terms of trade, aid, political relations, oil with the Arab states. And Brazil, as we heard from Dr. Feldberg, Brazil, of course, is interested in a Security Council seat. We don't know now what the EU is going to do. By traditional standards of when you recognize a state, the Palestinian state doesn't make it. No control over its territory, no defined borders, not really a government to which the people are obedient. I guess we have to ask the question, does any of this matter? You know, in a direct sense, it doesn't matter. It doesn't produce thunderclaps and huge changes instantly in the Middle East. And yet, it certainly does increase the sense of isolation of Israel in the international community. Israel, which once upon a time had very good relations with Latin American states. It increases the sense of isolation, not just because of the position that they're taking, the states are taking, but because it means that the normal standards that governments tend to apply when looking at the recognition issue, the normal standards, the traditional standards, are lifted when it comes to Israel and the Jews. They'll also feel isolated because they will assume that states that have just done this are going to vote with the Palestinians in the UN. It also tends, I would argue, to matter because it helps undermine the peace process. How's that? What is the peace process, theoretically? Theoretically, the peace process is a process of negotiation. First, successfully between Israel and Egypt, and Israel and Jordan. And then the theory is ultimately between Israel and Syria, Israel and Lebanon, Israel and Palestine. This recognition, it seems to me, logically says no negotiation, no compromises are needed. The Palestinians just get their final objective now through a UN vote. It seems to me very interesting that the statements by the Latin American governments actually, in a sense, reflect that by denying it. What I mean is, here's what Chile said. They recognize the Palestinian state, and then they say, it is essential to reinvigorate the process of negotiations in order to reach a full, definitive, and satisfactory peace agreement in accordance with the resolutions of the United Nations. Peru recognizes a Palestinian state and says that it reaffirms its respect for and full support of the Middle East peace process and restates its support for negotiations. Brazil does it and says it does so, short-circuiting the negotiations, of course. It does so, quote, with the conviction that negotiations between Israel and Palestine are vital for the achievement of mutual concessions on the main issues of the conflict. And they state their view that that conviction has not been abandoned with this decision. Now, I think what you're seeing here is, I guess I'd say, methinks the chancelleries doth protest too much. They know what they're doing. They see the contradiction. They try to if you will, worm their way out of it. In the end, of course, this recognition doesn't get the Palestinians a state. It doesn't advance the negotiations. In fact, it rewards them for not negotiating. And that's got to undermine the Middle East peace process. The excuse for it in some cases is this is probably a useful form of pressure on Israel. Israel once had a lot of support in Latin America from an earlier generation of leaders. But it doesn't do that. This kind of isolation does not make Israel more flexible. It makes Israel less flexible. It leads to a situation where all the Israelis care about now is the EU and the US. Isolation from the EU would really harm, not only bother, but harm Israel. So what the Latins have done, I think, with this wave of recognitions is they have dealt themselves entirely out of this game, out of whatever small roles they might possibly have had. These actions, in that sense, I would say, reflect Latin America's very small weight and influence in the international community. And that's very unfortunate. You know, look back. There was a moment, there was a decade, when Latin America democratized, let's say 1985 to 95 roughly, where you looked at Latin America and the leaders you saw were people like Alfonsín and Sanguinetti and Cardoso and Paz Estenssoro. And who was leading the UN? Pérez de Cuellar. And you had the impression that Latin America's weight in the international community would grow. But now, with the events in Ecuador and Bolivia and Venezuela, with the remarkable coming election in Peru, with a variety of dramas in Argentina, that moment seems to have passed. And I would argue that the foolish recognition of a Palestinian state in September is a symbol and a product of these unfortunate trends. Thank you.
Thank you, Elliot, for those characteristically insightful remarks. We will now hear from Daniel Mariachin. Dan Mariachin is the Executive Vice President of B'nai B'rith International, is the top executive at B'nai B'rith. He directs and supervises programs in more than 50 countries. He knows Latin America well, has traveled extensively throughout the region, and has just returned from there. He has served on, his resume is awfully long. He served on numerous official U.S. delegations to international conferences, and his op-eds and articles have appeared in literally every major U.S. publication, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and so forth.
Thank you, Ken. B'nai B'rith has had a long-standing presence in Latin America. We established our first office actually in Argentina in 1930, and today have 4 offices in the region and members in 18 countries. We are also the first Jewish organization accredited as an NGO at the OAS, and I'll talk about the OAS in just a moment. I'd like to begin by recounting a conversation I had with a Latin American diplomat in Geneva. I was in Geneva in March for the annual Israel bashing week, in which the infamous item 7, which is a basket of anti-Israel resolutions, they put them all into a basket. Israel is the only country singled out for this kind of opprobrium, and so each year we go and see if we can try to turn this around. We're unsuccessful, but we keep trying. But at that particular point, this was right in the middle of this succession of recognitions by Latin American countries, and I went to see an ambassador from one country, and they had just recognized the Palestinian state, and my first question was, do you believe in negotiations, the negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians? He said, yes. I said, well, why did your country prejudge the outcome of that negotiation? And it took her a little while, and you know, a little while in that kind of conversation is about 4 seconds. And it took her a little while, and she said, well, you know, there's a great deal of frustration out there with the lack of progress in the peace process. A little bit after that, I visited another Latin American country and met with its foreign minister. its outgoing foreign minister, and they too, in fact, one of those countries was, this country was just referenced in Elliot's presentation. And I asked the same question, and got the same kind of answer, but this was a country that, in explaining its decision to recognize, went back to, and this is raised in the earlier part of the program today, well, you know, in 1947, we recognized the partition. Now, that's true. They did in 1947. But to jump from 47 to 2011 without referencing various points along the way, the invasion of the new Israeli state in 1948, the creation of the PLO in 1964, the Six-Day War, the 1973 war, the logo used by many Palestinian organizations to this day, which is still basically the State of Israel. I mean, all of that comes in between. You know, we think of Abu Mazen's New York Times op-ed piece of now a couple of weeks ago, which was an interesting op-ed, except that it was an exercise in selective history, or amnesia, historical amnesia. And so there were these recognitions. I would say, I'm not sure that all of this was thought through very well, but if it was, it certainly is very contradictory. Now, let's just move a little bit to the topic of this particular program. Salam Fayyad, the Prime Minister of the West Bank, Salam Fayyad embarked in 2009 on a program to create institutions of government for a future Palestinian state. But he said in 2009 very clearly that this is going to be a 2-year program, and 2011, I'm not sure we use this term exactly, 2011 will be the year of decision. And I'm not sure people actually listened to that part of it or thought very much about it, because everybody would say, well, 2011, 2 years, that's a short time span. If you can build the institutions, well, that's not a bad idea. But maybe there was a method to the madness. Elliot referenced a recent interview in Newsweek with Abu Mazen, but then there was the 2009 interview of Abu Mazen by Jackson Deal in the Washington Post, where, this is a loose paraphrase, but it's pretty close, where Abu Mazen said, and this is after the whole settlements flap, where he said, you know, all I have to do is just sit here now, and this is all going to be brought to us. So maybe Fayyad was saying, and Abu Mazen certainly was saying, in that 2009 interview with Jackson Deal, that the Palestinian approach, even at that point, was to have the international community do the heavy lifting, to do the end run, to circumvent the real and necessary work of negotiations. 242 and 338 were referenced. Let's go to Oslo, the Quartet. Every international effort at resolving this contentious issue has been based on negotiations. Sometimes there have been, sometimes there haven't. There have been peaks and valleys, but that's been the baseline of activity toward resolving the situation. Now, I want to bring it back to Latin America and then to conclude with some comments about the process going forward. I just want to refer to what I would refer to the Venezuela for just a moment, because I think that's important in understanding exactly where Latin America is today. Countries like Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Ecuador, they support and have supported the Palestinian strategy. We know that these are governments not only hostile to Israel, but have opened the door for Iran and other rogue regimes to set foot in the hemisphere. The demonization and delegitimization of Israel in those countries and by those countries have in fact reached unprecedented levels. Examples of this are recent exhibitions organized by the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Information and Communication, Science and Technology in Venezuela, which compare Israelis to Nazis and denounces the alleged ethnic cleansing committed by the Israelis against the Palestinians. And the pure anti-Semitic rhetoric present in state-sponsored media in Venezuela and other places has reached unprecedented levels. And when the Venezuelan government decided to break relations with Israel during the Gaza campaign in January of 2009, Bolivia immediately followed suit. Nicaragua decided to suspend diplomatic ties. You heard what happened after with Israel after the flotilla incident in 2010. And Ecuador not only withdrew its ambassador from Israel for consultations, but also tried to introduce a resolution condemning Israel at the 2010 OAS General Assembly in Lima. Now, beyond those countries, support for the Palestinian strategy in Latin America did come as a surprise to many. It came as a surprise to some in this country, to some in Israel. But the truth is that for several years now, most Latin American countries, including those that have had traditionally good bilateral relations with Israel, continuously vote against Israel at the United Nations and in other multilateral fora, aligning themselves with the Group of 77 and the OIC. There are a few exceptions, of course. Panama and Colombia have been referenced, Guatemala, and a few other countries. Now, the reasons are complex. You heard about them earlier. The issue is this really against Israel? Is this really, when you vote against Israel, are you voting against the United States in terms of the orientation of various foreign policies? There's no question that many countries, I think, do vote against Israel with that in mind, that they are also voting against the United States. Now, in the case of the recognition, and to bring it back to recognition, there's no question there was intense lobbying work on the Palestinian side in Latin America, kind of under the radar, I think, to a large extent during the end of 2010 and into early this year. I think that lobbying effort was aimed at the summit of the Arab and Latin American countries, which had been scheduled for Peru in February of this year and which was canceled because of the uprisings in North Africa and in the Middle East. Now, the drive for Palestinian recognition in Latin America is, of course, gained at obtaining garnering part of what the Palestinians hope will be 140 or 150 countries to make their point. There's no question that should this come to the UN Security Council, I think it became clear in President Obama's two speeches on Middle East / Israeli-Palestinian issues, one on Thursday and one on Sunday, that the United States does not support UDI, does not support this recognition plan. So let's assume for a minute that there will be a veto in the Security Council. I think that the European component in this is extremely important. I would go back to February of this year when there was a settlements resolution that came up in the Security Council. There was an American veto, and 14 countries voted for that resolution, including 4 from Europe, the UK, Germany, France, and Portugal. And one would have expected, at the very least, abstentions from our European allies. I think a U.S. veto essentially held the door open for those countries to walk through, and we certainly wouldn't want to see a repeat of that again in September. Clearly, the Palestinian side knows very well that the General Assembly does not have the authority under the UN Charter to admit a new member, even though they talk of uniting for peace and various maneuvers that have been tried in, I think, 1975 and 1981. But it's unlikely that that they will be able to achieve membership in the according to the bylaws or according to the Constitution. No question, though, maintaining and gathering the support for the initiative, they would hope to expect not only the marginalization, expect to marginalize Israel, but also to embarrass the U.S., as they did in February with the settlements resolution, when essentially a finger was stuck in the eye of the United States on the issue of bringing this resolution to the Security Council. Now, what happens now? All of these recognitions, 11 of them in South America. Panama has not. Mexico actually has not. Colombia has not. And more likely than not, they will not if they haven't by now. And the numbers probably will stay the same in Latin America. But I certainly agree with Elliot and with all else that's been said about this issue of circumventing negotiations. It would have a catastrophic effect on the peace process, raising Palestinian expectations to unmeetable levels, and again reinforcing in the Israeli mind that nothing they do is okay in the eyes of the international community. And therefore, you know, this ambassador that I met in Geneva, who was frustrated, if I were an Israeli, I'd be frustrated. at least with the international community, in terms of the way it's been treated. Now, the reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas has added an extra layer of uncertainty, and that's certainly a mild way of putting it, to the whole notion of recognition. Now, the two Obama speeches, and I'm sure what's going to go on in Europe this week and over the summer, will certainly be a lot of grist for discussion on this issue going forward. Now, what we've been doing, and I think others have been doing as well, is even those countries that may have offered this recognition, whether they be in Latin America or elsewhere, ought to consider in September whether or not they want to cast their vote for. It's not a matter here of national pride. It's not a matter of sticking a finger in the eye of the U.S. or any other party, but it is a matter of if you really believe in a possible resumption of negotiations. And, you know, many in Europe, I think the Council of Ministers in Europe had a statement yesterday calling for urgent resumption of negotiations. Whether or not that's in the offing, I'm not sure. But certainly, if anyone believes in the process or believes in a resumption of the process, unilateral declaration and recognition is not the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, for those very informative remarks. We now will hear from Aaron David Miller. Aaron David Miller served as an advisor to 6 U.S. Secretaries of State on Middle East affairs during a 24-year career at the State Department. Between 1988 and 2003, he participated in American efforts to broker agreements between Israel, Jordan, Syria, and the Palestinians. He left to become president of Seeds of Peace, an international youth organization devoted to Middle East peace. He is today a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars here in Washington. He, too, writes regularly for major publications such as the Washington Post and the New York Times. His fourth book, The Much Too Promised Land, America's Elusive Search for Arab-Israeli Peace, was published in 2008, and his fifth book, Can America Have Another Great President, is scheduled to be published next year.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I know nothing about Latin America, and that is the first and last time I'm actually going to mention the word. What I want to do is try to set the whole issue of Palestinian statehood at the UN into the broader context of American policy and the Arab-Israeli peace process. I have no organizational affiliation any longer. I work for a center in Washington, the Living Memorial of Woodrow Wilson, our only PhD president. There was a reason for that. Having a PhD, I know what that reason was. Wilson was a believer in bringing government and the academy together. I think that's a very fine idea. Wilson wasn't a believer, in my judgment, in what I'm going to try to do in 7 or 8 minutes, which is to offer up what I call cruel and unforgiving analysis. All right, because that's what I think we need. I don't care what side you're on, anti-Israel, pro-Israel, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, whether you ascribe to the left or the right, conservative or liberal. The dividing line for American policy, and there's only one, should be smart versus dumb. And that, I mean that. This is not an effort to, it's not even a false endorsement of civility, which is important in our political dialogue and culture. And civility is important, not because it's some formalized set of requirements to be polite. It's important because maybe, just maybe, somebody else who has a fundamentally different point of view than yours might be able to offer up something of value. And since government is about remedy, otherwise, what's the point of it? We ought to be looking for remedies on the smart side, not on the dumb side. It was Mencken, one of our great philosophers, who said that in a democracy it's unfashionable to talk about the disease without talking about the remedy. Mencken was wrong about many things, but he was absolutely right about this. Talking about the disease is absolutely essential. Understanding the way the world is before you come up with an RX to try to change it is really important, because America gets itself into trouble when we don't look at reality. and we make policy on the basis of the world the way we want it to be, rather than on the way the world really is. In this case, the disease, I don't like that word, dis-ease, I like that much better, is an Arab-Israeli peace process which at the moment suffers from fundamental and structural problems. And what the Palestinians are doing tactically, since statehood is not, at the UN, is not a strategy, it's a tactic, even they don't believe in it, is a response and a reflection of the dysfunction that exists. And that dysfunction is driven, and I'm not here to moralize or editorialize, it's driven by three basic realities. The gaps on the core issues that separate Israelis and Palestinians, Jerusalem border security and refugees, are large. And the notion that everybody knows where this problem is going to end, how it's going to be resolved, is in fact to trivialize and demean just how hard it's going to be to get to a conflict-ending agreement. Yes, fine, everybody knows where it's going to end, but then again, getting there is what it's always been about. Number two, the leaders who are tasked with this challenge are prisoners of their constituencies. They are not masters of their politics. The Begins, the Sadats, the Rabins, the Husseins, even the Arafats in his first incarnation are gone. Where are the great men and women who are prepared to step up and make these decisions? We do not have statesmen. We have politicians. On the Israeli side, you have a deeply divided polity. With a prime minister, I like to say Bibi is at war with Netanyahu. And I mean this seriously. The tough-talking Likud politician with his ideological and family constraints is at war with Netanyahu, the man who wants to be only the fourth Israeli prime minister to serve in two non-consecutive terms, the first Israeli prime minister born in Israel after the creation of the state. He's an authentic, legitimate response to Israeli politics and society. But Bibi is at war with Netanyahu, the man who wants to do big things, who wants to lead Israel out of the shadow of the Iranian bomb. And then there's Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian national movement over which he presides. Even today, a Noah's Ark. It is a Noah's Ark. There are two of everything. Even in the face of virtual unity, there are two of everything. And unity will remain elusive. It will not unify guns, it will not unify money, and it will not unify political strategy. If it doesn't do any of that, what is it? It's a political agreement designed to serve purposes. For Hamas, it reflects an untenable situation in Damascus, which they may ultimately have to vacate, and it reflects the importance of Egypt. Rafah is critical to Hamas's viability, and Egypt brokered this accord. Egypt wanted this, and Hamas did this in large part for Egypt. This was not done in a peace process context. It had nothing to do with the peace process. And finally, an uncertain regional environment. Big gaps, weak leaders, uncertainty in the region. That is why we have a problem in the Arab-Israeli peace process. So the question is, from my point of view, since I still cling to the notion, illusory though it may be right now, that negotiations still offer up the only possible pathway to a conflict-ending agreement, what do you do about a Palestinian initiative designed to create virtual statehood in September? I'm not sure that's going to be possible. I think that the president's speech on Thursday, as you look for why would the president give such a speech on the eve of the visit of the Israeli prime minister at a time when there's absolutely no chance for negotiation, in the wake of a Fatah-Hamas unity deal, almost certain to be criticized not only by Republicans, by liberal Democrats who comprise his own base. Why would the president do this? This was not driven by ideology. It wasn't driven because the president believes it's possible to have a peace process. It was driven, like most things in government, or many things, by scheduling and by the reality that the president is off to the G8. And the G8 is important here because it is an American policy to separate the French and the British from the Russians and the Chinese and the Palestinians as we go forward toward September. The logic of this speech was to try to get the Europeans to side with the president against virtual statehood in September. Will it work? I don't know. But that is the logic. There certainly can't be any other logic, because it has brought a considerable amount of criticism on both the timing and on the substance. A few additional points. The only possibility, in my judgment, of preempting a UN initiative in September would be not a loud and noisy American initiative, not another speech, but a quiet effort on the part of the president to create some common ground in the next 3 or 4 months between Mahmoud Abbas and Benjamin Netanyahu on the two issues that the president identified in his speech: borders and security. Of the 4 core issues, the other 2 being refugees in Jerusalem, those are the identity issues. Those are identity issues, even though Jerusalem has a territorial component. Security and borders are territorial issues. They are less hopeless than the other 2. And I would predict, I would actually go beyond prediction. I would say there is a very, very strong possibility that in the next several weeks, an effort will be made. It may not be known to those of us who inhabit the public space, but an effort is going to be made to launch a highly discreet diplomatic initiative to see whether or not terms of reference cannot be established between these 2 using an American envoy/broker in some form to do it. That, to me, is the only possible recourse to avoid confusion, disorder, and perhaps even success from the Palestinian point of view in New York. Virtual statehood, like virtual unity, will not accomplish much. It's a tactical objective to get people's attention, to demonstrate, and I think Elliot here is correct, Mahmoud Abbas will probably not run again, but if he chooses to leave and subject himself to history's judgment, he would like to be the Palestinian president. And since there have only been 2, if Arafat started the process of redemption of the Palestinians in Palestine, then Abbas would like to leave office contributing unity and the formality of international recognition of statehood. That's where I think he is. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Aaron, for that fascinating analysis. I will borrow your term, cruel and unforgiving. I will be a cruel and unforgiving moderator. We have time for questions, but let's keep the questions short and direct them to the panel. And please identify yourself. Thank
you. Stuart Sloan, Vice Chairman of the American Jewish International Relations Institute. This question is for the panel, but it's really specifically about a comment that Dan made. And that was the comment about the Uniting for Peace formula, which is the presumed strategy in the General Assembly of the Palestinians following a veto in the Security Council. And Dan, you dismissed it, pointing to some past uses of that formula. But I would suggest that it is part of an essential part of the delegitimization campaign against Israel. The Uniting for Peace formula was used to get allies in the Korean War in the face of a certain Russian veto. And many countries signed on. Similarly, with respect to South Africa. What could happen here is a strong vote in favor of a Palestinian state in the Uniting for Peace formula could give political cover for those countries that wish to perform the BDS, as they say, the boycotts, sanctions, and deal with divestment.
Can you pose your question, please?
All right. The question is, how damaging would a strong vote in favor of, in this Uniting for Peace formula, be to Israel if this is the formula by which many countries will break relations, go along with sanctions, or do other things economically to hurt Israel?
Dan, do you want to?
Yeah, well, I didn't dismiss it. I think, look, if we came to a Uniting for Peace situation, I think it would create, frankly, some kind of, I don't want to say crisis, but it would create some kind of difficulty between the General Assembly and the Security Council. Now, look, we're all keeping our powder dry here. Anything can happen. I heard the earlier speaker talked about, when asked where would Costa Rica go, and or where would other countries go, and there's now seems to be, I don't want to put any markers down, but there seems to be some hesitation here on the part of some. And now some of that may have to do with the President's speech on Thursday and his speech before AIPAC on Sunday. Some of it may have to do with some second thoughts. It would be, if you had 150, 160, 170 countries that were voting and moving toward a Uniting for Peace and trying to force this issue, it would create problems for Israel. But I think that the issue of who is the first among equals between the Security Council and the General Assembly on issues relating to sovereignty and the creation of states and the blessing, if you will, quote unquote, of new states, I think would create some kind of crisis. So it's probably a little bit too early to tell. I mean, we're taking the temperature almost every week on this issue to see where countries are headed. But yeah, it would. If it went to that point, it would cause increased isolation for Israel and difficulty for Israel.
Yes. Again, let me remind everyone to direct a question to a member of the panel, please. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Dan Pollock from the Zionist Organization of America. One of the things that the President was criticized for, and I'll direct this primarily to Elliot Abrams, is the minimalization, possibly in his speeches, of the difficulty for the United States of the Hamas-Fatah agreement. He really didn't dwell on it. In the first speech, he said it was a problem for Israel. In the second speech at AIPAC, he said it was a problem for the United States as well. But it's the suspicion by those of us in the pro-Israel community is sometimes we're thinking that the United States is looking for a way out of that problem in order to restart negotiations. Is that what the State Department is thinking? And if any of you on the panel have an insight into that.
I think it's certainly what the rest of the quartet is thinking. After the Hamas victory in the 2006 Palestinian parliamentary election, there was remarkable quartet unity. The three quartet conditions were announced, and they were kept, and the four parties stayed absolutely solid. And the reason for that was Hamas. The Europeans and the Russians were looking for the exits, and had Hamas shown a degree of flexibility, had they said, well, we're not going to agree to this, but maybe in a few years, maybe someday, maybe if perhaps anything from Hamas. But they didn't get anything from Hamas. So there was no pretext upon which to move. One variable here is, what will Hamas do? Will Hamas create a pretext? You know, they're in direct discussions with the Russians constantly. I mean, have been for years. And certainly some Europeans are in contact with them as well, and probably trying to find ways to come up with the magic phrase that will move some people in Europe. Now, State Department, I guess one shouldn't refer to the department, one should refer to the Secretary and President Obama. I think they know that politically you can't, quote, negotiate with Hamas It's the little steps toward it that I think are more likely. For example, what happens when the Palestinians say, there's no Hamas in this government. There's a technocratic government, no Fatah, no Hamas. Well, that may be true. And that then relates to U.S.-Palestinian Authority relations. What about the PLO? Even Arafat kept Hamas out of the PLO. Now, Abbas is letting him in, because part of this agreement is to allow Hamas, an organization that's dedicated to the destruction of the State of Israel, to become part of the body whose job it is to negotiate with Israel, which is the PLO. So I worry about it. I worry about small, incremental moves away from a hardline position. And what will save us, frankly, is not going to be the State Department. It's going to be Hamas, which, you know, people in Europe are always surprised to find that when they say they're in favor of the destruction of Israel, they're in favor of the destruction of Israel. And they're dedicated to that goal. So as long as they remain, as the French say, pur et dur, dedicated to their goals, that will prevent anybody in Europe or anywhere else from deviating.
Can I just offer a brief comment? I think a lot of, well, Elliot's analysis is correct, but in the end what will save us is a reality, which no one wants to face up to again. And that is no Israeli government, I don't care from whether it's Kadima, Labor, or Likud, is going to make what from Israel's perspective are existential decisions to a Palestinian Authority that does not have a monopoly, and I'll be very clear here, a monopoly over the forces of violence within its own society. That, in the end, is elemental to the concept of sovereignty. Unless you control all of the guns, and we obviously, this society is not a good example of that, but in terms of political violence, unless you control all of the guns, you can never gain the respect of your own constituents, let alone your neighbors. So without one authority, one gun, and one negotiating position, the idea of a two-state solution will remain an illusion. That, in the end, is, if you need an insurance policy, and I would argue you do not, that, in the end, is the greatest hedge against this. There will be no Palestinian state without that. And that, at the moment, is almost impossible to imagine.
Okay, great. Alan.
When the president stressed the fact that you would have a demilitarized Palestine, and he hasn't stressed that very often, but when he made that stress, doesn't that answer the question that you just raised?
No, it doesn't. Well, first of all, I mean, this is, no, I'm glad he said demilitarization, but this, in my judgment, doesn't really guarantee anything. Each of these issues, including security arrangements, is a universe of detail and a universe of important critical minutiae which are going to have to be joined and negotiated by the party, including the idea of, and the president identified this as well, that Palestine will have a discrete border with Jordan. That Palestine will have a discrete border with Jordan. That is a highly contestable proposition from an Israeli security perspective. So there are all kinds of chapter headings, including demilitarization, that will have to be negotiated and secured. And I frankly, at the moment, I wouldn't invest or be reassured by any single word that anybody uses with respect to this negotiation. What will make this negotiation work, the only thing, is when Israelis and Palestinians sit down, yelling, screaming, arguing, laughing with one another over a period of time to solve in a mutually acceptable way these problems, because only that will guarantee a fix to what you allude to, which is the proximity problem. It was Ben Franklin, who argued that proximity breeds children and contempt. And it is the Israeli-Palestinian problem is a proximity problem. And the proximity problem can only be addressed in a real, genuine, and authentic way, not by presidential speeches and slogans, but by the hard work that produced the other two negotiations with Israel's neighbors that have survived for decades, however unsatisfactory they may be from the perceptions of both sides.
We are running low on time. There are a lot of hands. Let's go in the back, and then we'll do one more after this.
Hi, Ashley March, the Cato Institute. Would somebody, just in respect of the request to the United Nations, state the key differences between the Jewish request in 47-48 and the Palestinian request now?
The Palestinian and Jewish requests? I mean, relating to the six-day boundaries issue?
No. The request to the UN for recognition. The key difference between the Jewish request in 48 and the Palestinian request now, if any.
Well, I'd just take one. The UN did not, in a sense, respond to a Jewish request. The UN gave the British a mandate in Palestine. And when it gave the mandate to the British, it did so, this is after the Balfour Declaration, having in mind the establishment of a Jewish state. The partition plan called for the establishment of a Jewish state and an Arab state in Palestine. The problem we have now is that while, as Prime Minister Netanyahu said to Congress, I believe his number was 6 consecutive Israeli prime ministers have been willing to acknowledge the Arab-Palestinian state, there has not yet been a Palestinian leader willing to acknowledge the foundation and existence of a Jewish state, the other half of the partition resolution.
What are you saying? You are saying that this mutual recognition between the PLO and Rabin, Arafat is not a recognition of the state of Israel? Even going to the United Nations is an affirmation of the recognition of the state of Israel within the 1967 boundaries. So it's not really what you are saying is not accurate. And what Netanyahu said yesterday was totally inaccurate. Because he himself, in 1998, was the Prime Minister of Israel. He did not come to terms with the independent Palestinian state. Only after his second term that he talked about the two states. And if you listen to him yesterday, the state he is talking about is not a state. It's a mockery of a state. And I will tell you, no Palestinian leader or even Palestinian citizen will accept a state under the terms that Mr. Netanyahu is talking about. So let's be accurate when we come to this. And even, let me tell you this. But I want to make one final remark. If there's one person in the Palestinian people who believes in non-violence, it is Mahmoud Abbas. And you know that, Aaron, and you know it yourself, because he was the only Palestinian who stood to say that I am opposed to violent intifada, even when Arafat was still alive. And he was criticized and he was demonized because of his position. So he knows what it entails to bring Hamas in. He's going to the United Nations with Hamas with him in a unity government recognizing the right of Israel within the 1967 boundaries. So let's just set the record straight on those issues.
Sure, thank you. Well, we have a different view of this. In June 2003, then Prime Minister Abbas came to Aqaba and opposed terrorism, both on two grounds. First, because it's harmful for the Palestinian people, It does not serve the interests of the Palestinian people. And secondly, because it is wrong and immoral, he said. It was a complete renunciation of terrorism. Yet, twice now, once in the Mecca Agreement in 2007 and now 2011, he is seeking to create a unity government with a terrorist group. Moreover, that terrorist group is dedicated to the destruction of the State of Israel. Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas prime minister, said this month that the goal is the end of the Zionist project in Palestine. That's who he's creating a unity agreement with. So I think it's hard to say that that is so clearly the Palestinian position. As to what the Palestinians will accept, you know, if you look at the WikiLeaks versions of what Palestinian negotiators were talking to the Israelis about, it's not, it doesn't seem to me to be so far. I remember conversations about the establishment of a Palestinian airport back in those days when there were negotiations. And I remember then Secretary of State Rice saying to the Palestinian delegation, you know, we in the United States have enormous difficulties, not just on 9/11, but since 9/11, in maintaining the security of our airports. You're not going to be able to do it. And the Israelis would be nuts to allow you to establish an airport. Now, is this a violation of Palestinian sovereignty? You bet your life to say to a country, you can't have an airport. But one has to be realistic about this. If there is going to be an agreement on the establishment of a Palestinian state, it is going to have its sovereignty limited in that agreement in a number of ways. It's not such a crazy idea. Every single country in Europe has made agreements that limit its sovereignty in ways that most Americans would find bizarre and most Latins would find bizarre. But they did it in the EU, and they did it voluntarily, and they believe it is in their interest. So either that's going to happen in a final status agreement, or, and I would have to say I agree with Aaron, we're not really on the verge of a final status agreement anyway. We're not anywhere near it. But what I find striking is not what, I'll just end with this, sorry, not what Arafat said in speeches or Abbas said in speeches, but rather that when an offer, an actual genuine offer was made to Arafat by Barak at the cost of Barak's prime ministership, he turned it down. And when Ehud Olmert did the same thing in his last months in office to President Abbas, he turned it down. And that, it seems to me, is a more significant indication of the fundamental Palestinian position than speeches.
Ken, if I may, just one point on recognition. One point on recognition. Yeah. The issue of recognizing Israel is quite frankly becoming more and more disingenuous. And that's why the Prime Minister, but not just the Prime Minister, but so many others, talk about recognizing a Jewish state. Now President Obama is using the term in every speech he makes, in every comment he makes about a Jewish state. And it's an important point to make. I have heard Abu Mazen many times, and others. I have heard your successor, once removed, say, just in the last couple of days, well, look, whatever Israel calls itself, it has a right to call itself. That's not the point. We know what Israel calls itself. We know we call it the Jewish state. The issue is it's very important, and it's important for reasons that you know. So it's not just a matter of recognizing a Palestinian state and nobody could ever accept it because the terms are so draconian. There's another issue here, and the issue is the recognition of a Jewish state. There's a reason for it in terms of renunciation of claims and getting to the end of this process. So I didn't want to leave that particular point open because it's important.
Sure, Aaron, and this will be the last.
One final point of this. I mean, the Palestinian issue is idiosyncratic. When the Egyptians and the Israelis negotiated, and the Israelis and the Jordanians negotiated, there may have been a desire on the part of the Israelis to have Israeli recognition as the Jewish nation state of the Jewish people formally incorporated into their treaty arrangements. It was never incorporated. And it was never incorporated because the Egyptian and Jordanian treaty models, for many reasons, are much different. This gets to the core issue of identity and proximity. And it is because of identity and proximity and the corresponding fears on those two issues that this issue will be joined, must be joined. And it's just another challenge that's going to have to be overcome, difficult though it may be.
Look, I want to thank our panelists. This has been an extraordinarily enlightening discussion. And on behalf of my colleague Jaime Darrenblum, I want to thank everyone for coming and thank our Hudson Institute communications team for pulling this event together. Thank you very much.